Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For our guests here in-house, we would ask that courtesy check that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. For those watching online, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And of course, we will post today's program on our website for everyone's future reference as well. Our discussion today will be led by who I will call a protege of John von Kannon, our Senior Vice President for Development, John Fogarty. But prior to starting, I want to remind the gentleman on the stage of what John always told me. If he was in a room as I was coming to the podium, sour-faced, worrying about whether the microphones were going to work, his last line always was, and is now to the gentleman, "Make sure you smile."
Thank you, John. So a priest, a rabbi, and a chicken walk into a bar. The bartender looks right up and says, "Nope, get out of here. We don't do jokes." And then the chicken turns around and says, "Come on, guys, I know a place across the road." So to paraphrase a great Texan, I served with John von Kannon. I knew John von Kannon. Fogarty, you're no John von Kannon. But I did have as John said, the pleasure the honor to serve under John and learn from John for about 11 years. And it is a lot of fun to be able to celebrate today the first ever John von Kannon Day at Heritage Foundation. So welcome. You're all part of a historic day, and you may not have even known it, but this will certainly not be the last. And if you ask me where the after-hours party is, the monocle would be the answer to that. Nick is ready for all of us in John's honor. Delighted to have with us so many of John's friends and other proteges, other fundraisers throughout the conservative movement, and most excited to have with us John's widow, as we were talking before, the Merry Widow, Cindy von Kannon. So Cindy, welcome back, of course, to Heritage, and you're always, as you know, a part of the Heritage family. So it's going to be fun. The book today we're talking about is a book that obviously was inspired by John's life. We will all have opportunities to hold a copy, to take a copy with you afterwards. It's The 10 Laws of Fundraising. It was inspired by John's life and by his work and his legacy. And what we're going to be doing today is talking a little bit about what's in the book, what John taught us, and how we believe fundraising can be great. We've got a little phrase that we use here at Heritage within the development team, and that is that we take our jobs very seriously, but we never, ever take ourselves very seriously. We take our jobs very seriously, but we don't ever take ourselves very seriously. And John didn't coin that phrase, but it was inspired by how he lived his life and how he took things. And if most of you here live and work in Washington, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on, this is a crazy town that can really get to you. And if you take yourselves too seriously, if you don't laugh at yourself or laugh at the other guy, it's going to beat you down. And that's happened to many folks. Never happened to John. He had a sense of life. He had the joie de vivre, the love of people and the love of life that was just contagious. And that made for not only great fundraising, but it made for just great company. I remember interviewing in September of 2004, and I interviewed with Ann Fitzgerald at the time, and then with John in his office, and went through a battery of questions, et cetera, fundraising, yada, yada. And I asked, he said, any questions for me? And I said, I only have one question. Is this a fun place to work? And John was like, "Ah!" And he looked over at the statue, the knight in shining armor that Cindy had gotten him. It's a statue to his right. And he looked over at a quote from Churchill on the wall that said, "Tact is the ability to tell people to go to hell and help them enjoy the journey." And he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, we'll find out." And John was absolutely right. This place, because of him, and I think this movement so much because of him, is a fun place to work. He also took his job very seriously. That's resulted in, obviously, more than $1 billion raised for heritage and causes he worked at over the time he was here. But also the number of people that he inspired throughout the movement, fundraisers at Heritage and in many other organizations, so many of you represented today, but not just fundraisers, folks in policy, folks in communications and research, CEOs and others. And he knew that fundraising was not this necessary evil, not banging the tin cup or hitting people up. I mean, how inspiring is that anyway? How well would that work, banging the tin cup? He knew that, as we do now, that great fundraising has the ability to change the world. We believe, how many of you came up on the elevator today? Good. You saw on the wall in the elevator there, Heritage, our vision is building an America where freedom and opportunity and prosperity and civil society flourish. Well, again, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on, our strong belief here is that civil society is a core to American greatness. And you can look back to Tocqueville, who talked about the strength of a democracy can be traced back to the foundations of its private citizens and private enterprise. And you look at the nexus between the individual and the government, and what you have in the middle there are these great organizations, these great institutions of civil society. The hospitals, the educational, private educational institutions, the Rotary clubs, the think tanks, the churches, the Knights of Columbuses, the Daughters of the American Revolution, all of those organizations there strengthen the bonds, allow Americans to serve one another. And frankly, as conservatives at Heritage, we believe a stronger civil society leads to less government and more opportunities for those individuals. But these organizations, these mitigating organizations in the middle, don't succeed on their own. They succeed best through great fundraising. And you have folks, you have the ratings agencies and all these other groups that look at, well, you've got mission and then you have fundraising. Or you have mission and then you have communications. Or you got mission and you got administration. It's all mission. And John knew that very well. He believed that. Folks will say, well, John wasn't just a fundraiser. John wasn't even a fundraiser. No, John was a great man. He was a great conservative. He knew how to sell ideas. He was passionate about ideas. And regardless of what, again, side of the aisle you're on or what level of work you do, if you're passionate about those ideas, you know how to talk about them, you know how to sell them, things are going to work out quite well. So when you look at this book later, look at it from the vantage point of not a how-to book on fundraising, but almost a why-to book on fundraising. There's a lot of tips on fundraising there. You'll get some of those how-tos, and we'll talk through some of those and lessons learned, and I hope each of you will participate in that too. But it's really the why, and John talked about that. John just lived that in his life. So we're looking forward to having a conversation about that today. We've got many folks joining us also online, and just several Heritage staff, our regional managers, our field staff there, other many Heritage donors. And by the way, some of John Von Cannon's biggest fans were Heritage donors. And he knew, as I think good fundraisers do, and he led that, he knew how to ask somebody for $1 million and then have them thank you. And I don't mean because, thank God you didn't ask me for $10 million. But that might have been the case sometimes. But really bringing joy to people's lives because they had the opportunity to invest in a cause and see the results of that investment over time. And so we thank all the Heritage donors out there who are watching in, particularly Todd and Linda Herrick of the Herrick Foundation, who have made all this work possible through their grant that established the John Von Kannon Fellowship in Philanthropy here at Heritage. And we're also joined online by a great friend of John, who John spent many days with in both Florida and his home in Cashiers, North Carolina, Rudy Silk. And I know Rudy, who is just celebrated his 91st birthday about 30 days ago, had spent a great deal of time with John. Rudy does a great deal of work with his hands, woodworking. And one time when John was out there in Cashiers visiting, he said, John, I probably built 4 chairs, but Von Kannon read 7 books while we were there together in one day. So we thank you, Rudy, and all the great Heritage friends. So without further ado, I want to walk back over here and invite you to meet our panel. Our panel includes the great Lee Edwards, who a fellow here in conservative thought at Heritage, a distinguished fellow, a author, legendary conservative in the movement, biographer of everyone from Barry Goldwater to Ronald Reagan to many others. Also wrote the biography of John Von Kannon within this book here. Not only is he a great scholar, writer, author, thinker, but he's also a fundraiser, too, in his role as the president and founder of the Victims of Communism Foundation. And so he's got some lessons there as well. To his left is Paul Cosby from New York. Paul is a co-author of this book. Paul is a playwright, an author, a fundraiser as well, great renown. Has written more than 6 dozen case studies for organizations throughout the movement. And to his left is our John Von Kannon Fellow in Philanthropy, J.B. Horton of Texas, who is the author of this book. Is a premier fundraiser at Heritage, an all-around good guy, and you have to forgive him for being from Texas, but thank him for being here. So we'll. I want to start off with Dr. Edwards and just ask you a pretty simple question: who was John Von Kannon, and who was he in the context of the conservative movement? You're the authoritative historian of the conservative movement. Who was John in that context?
Well, I don't think that John ever said no. People would come up to him. It might be at a meeting, it might be on the telephone, it might be some personal visit they came by here. And they'd say something like, well, John, we're trying to do this, or we're trying to figure out a way to approach this, and we want to raise this much money, and how do we go about that? And John always took time to sit down with them and give them advice. I mean, I can recall going to meetings of the Philadelphia Society, and there was the main speaker, but you'd always see a bunch of people clustered around John, trying to get a little extra insight and help from him. And he always was there for it. And the same thing, people would be, I'd be down on the 2nd floor. John was up in the rarefied 8th floor. And maybe I was feeling a little bit down myself. And I'd say, I need a little shot of joy. So I'd go up on the elevator to the 8th floor, and maybe if John were there, hey, John, you got to be, oh, come on in, come on. Hey, did you hear the one about? And he'd tell a joke, and off you'd go. And if you think about how he did that over and over and over again, year after year, decade after, giving of himself. He was a great giver. He understood the importance of giving. He also understood the importance of listening. And he talked about that over and over again, that you must, he said, understand the donor. And the way to understand him is to listen to him, to see what's on his mind, what he's concerned about, what he wants to have done. And I'm going to share, if I may, one of his favorite stories, and that is the one of Dick Myers. Down in Florida. So he increased his support one year, from $1,000 to $10,000. So John telephoned to thank him and to meet him at an upcoming heritage event. And afterwards, he asked Dick Palmer, I'm sorry, I got the last name wrong, Dick Palmer. He said, Dick, what'd you think of the event? And Dick said, terrible. Terrible? He said, yeah, it was terrible. I couldn't hear a damn thing. And I have perfectly good hearing.
As you went.
And John was trying not to stare at Dick's hearing aid. But he apologized profusely, of course. He went back in Washington, went up to Phil, who was the detail guy, Phil Trulock, who suggested, well, maybe we ought to start doing a little better job of testing the sound and the audio checks, and maybe even have 2 microphones at the podium, not just one. And Von Kannon, John, called Palmer to let him know about the changes. After a number of years and many more trips and donations, and this was something else that John was so good at, was he established this personal relationship. My goodness, if we were to open up this thing and ask everybody who had ever had some kind of personal relationship with John to show up, we wouldn't be able to put him in this room. Wouldn't be able to. They'd have to go downstairs and upstairs and all over the place. He was always sharing. So he finally was visiting with Dick Palmer after these years of this relationship. And it really had become more than a relationship. I don't like that word. Friendship. It was a friendship. That's really what it was. And he, talking to Dick, and Dick turned to him and said, you know, John, I like the Boy Scouts, and I like the Red Cross, but I love the Heritage Foundation. Why, Dick? You know, tell me, because you will pay attention to me. You listen. You listen. And that's what John did. He listened, he absorbed, and then he would, if he could, come up with maybe a solution, maybe a partial solution, maybe more than that as well. It's hard to think of the conservative movement and where it would be today if without all the little John Von Cannons who came along in his wake and who learned from him and who were taught by him. We would not be where we are today, John, if it were not for his contributions. Giving, 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 so many ways to so many different people and organizations. Now, of course, I have to finish up with a joke, right? Now, I'm not a good joke teller, but I'll do my best. This is one of John's favorites. A Southern preacher is worried about his teenage son and what he's going to turn out to be. So he decides to test him. He places a Bible, a bottle of bourbon, and a pile of money on the top of the dresser in his room. If he chooses the Bible, the preacher reasons, his son will be a man of God. If he chooses the bourbon, he'll be a drunk. If he takes the money, he will be a businessman. So the son comes home and goes into the room where the preacher is hiding. He takes a big swig of the bourbon, scoops up the money, puts it in his pocket, and walks out of the room. Oh, Lord, says the preacher, he's going to be a politician. But this was John's genius, that he topped that joke. He made a moral out of it. He said, let's tell Congress to put down the bottle and give the money back to the people. So he was making something out of a joke, and that was something also that he was tremendously good at. So many ways that he gave to the movement, gave to the country, gave to this organization unstintingly, without reserve, constantly, always being available, always saying yes when people came to him for advice and counsel.
Awesome. Thank you. heard that joke many times, and you told it well. And the genius of not just telling the joke, but making a lesson out of it. So JB, I've thought for the last, 18 months or so that John must have liked me better because he asked you to write the book.
Or maybe not.
Or maybe not. How did this book come about?
Yeah, before I answer that, John, I just want to thank Paul. What a journey this has been. It's been a true delight to work with you on this, and Lee, you as well. It's been a great project to be a part of. And I want to reiterate what you said in the welcome. There's a few people that, had they not been involved, we wouldn't be here today. One of them, you mentioned Todd Herrick. Man of deep integrity. He's not here today, but I felt it appropriate to reiterate that thank you. The Wells Foundation was another big supporter to make this happen. And another partner, I have to say, is Cindy Von Kannon. Cindy, thank you for your support and your encouragement throughout this process, for answering my random crazy phone calls about crazy ideas for this book, and being so gracious the whole time. I really appreciate it. Will y'all all join me in thanking you? Sweet people. Thank you. So how this book came about 2 weeks before John passed away, it was in September of 2015, and I got to visit he and Cindy's townhouse about a mile from here. It was a privilege to go and visit with him. I know many of you had that opportunity towards the end of his life. I knew that would be the last time John and I would get to speak together. He was battling a terminal illness, and I was prepared to go with the mindset of ministering to him. That's what I wanted to do. Go and be there in his time of need, to minister to him, to pray with him, and just to encourage him. I thought that he would be naturally self-consumed with his ailments, like most people are. I was wrong. I was totally wrong. I was not the minister, I was the ministee, if you will. John wanted to put me at ease, absolute ease. He wanted to tell jokes, like Lee said, some of which I can't repeat today. He wanted me to be the center of attention, not him. But that was John. And we didn't talk a lot about work. We talked more about friendships. We talked about our shared faith. And we talked about life. He reiterated how much he loves his kids. Jack and Rachel, he loved Cindy. I mean, we talked about family and meaningful things. And I was so uplifted. It was unbelievable. After I left, I was uplifted. But he did share one regret in that conversation, and that was that he didn't get to finish his book. And so I don't know if it was a moment of inspiration or a moment of temporary insanity, but I said, John, I would like to finish your book. And he was in a hospital bed in the middle of his living room, and he leaned over and raised up, squarely looked at me in the eye with tears in his eyes, and he said, JB, you honor me. I'll never, ever forget that moment. And immediately I took out a pad of paper and a pen, and I said, John, I want to get your ideas for this book. I want to get your vision, your thoughts. So the first question I asked him, I said, John, how many chapters have you written? And he said, 1. And I said, just 1? And he said, yeah, and I don't really like it. So after talking to him about his vision, his thoughts, talking with Cindy, talking with many of my colleagues, John included, who had talked to John about his ongoing book project, I learned through that he had a conflict. He had a conflict about how he was going to write this book. On one hand, he had 35 years of fundraising knowledge, and he wanted to impart that wisdom to people in a practical way, the how-to of fundraising. On the other hand, his passion was for stories and for friendships and for sharing impacts that people make when they give a contribution to a meaningful cause. So that's the why-to, if you will, like John mentioned. So how do you bridge the how-to and the why-to? And for John Von Kannon, it was very difficult because he had so much experience. And he was an excellent writer, absolutely a superb writer. So I think that was his ongoing roadblock. How do you balance those two? So a few months later, I was researching his notes and the books he read and the lists of books that he read, Cindy. It was unbelievable how many books he read. But I ran across a document on his computer, and it was titled John Von Cannon's Fundraising Laws. I thought, what is this? So I clicked on it, and it was 10 principles, 10 laws that John Von Cannon wrote. I'm convinced he was trying to mimic Dr. Fulner's laws, but he was going to do it for fundraising. And when I clicked on it, I noticed it wasn't complete. It had never been distributed, never been published, but the only one missing was number 9. So I thought, this is the perfect thing because it allows us to have, more Paul than me, the creativity to write about the how and the why of fundraising by using those broad principles. Principle number 9, law number 9, it was easy to fill it in because through John's works and in deeds, after talking with Jeff Trimbath and Martin Gillespie and Richard McAdams and others, we not only learned through his example, but through his words, that there is no substitute for hard work, right? So that was easy to put as number 9. So that completed the John Von Cannon fundraising laws. You received, I think, a bookmark when you walked in, and on the back of the bookmark are those 10 laws. And the way we structure the book is each chapter heading is one of the different laws. So there's 11 chapters in the book. There's the 10 laws, one for each chapter, and then the 11th chapter is a summary chapter of those laws, followed by Lee's outstanding bio. And I encourage you to read it, especially the bio, because it will make you laugh and cry. It is well done. So that's how the book came about, and it's truly been an honor to be part of it.
It's great.
Yeah.
It's great to know that your second book is coming out next year.
It'll be the second edition
Well done.
with the workbook attached.
So, Paul, well, let's bring you into the conversation. Welcome to Heritage.
Well, thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
Or is it welcome back? Your first time to Heritage?
Yes.
All right,
Yeah.
great. Well, you're in the Parthenon.
Yes.
You never had the pleasure to meet John, but you've spent the better part of the last year or so working with this book, with his materials. Tell us a little bit about that experience, and also maybe do it in the lens of all the writing you've done before on fundraising, cases for support, and the like. And then I'd be interested to know who you're going to cast in the play, in the theatrical version of this too. That you'll play. That's a side of it.
That's good.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for welcoming me here today. And the first thing I need to say is thank you, John, and thank you, JB, for bringing me into this project. Because it's, I don't know how many of you have heard of Jerry Panis. Is there? Well, the first time I ever wrote for Jerry, I got a phone call from him. I'd met him at a friend's daughter's, the wedding of a friend's daughter. And he called and said, "Paul, this is Jerry. I wonder if you'd write case statements for me. We don't pay a lot." And I said, "Well, how can I resist that?" But Jerry called and said, "I have an opportunity for you if you would like to avail yourself of it." I'd never written a book and was quite intimidated, but I just want to say, working with JB, you were absolutely the rudder that just kept us going forward day in and day out. I did not think it would take a year. It certainly did, but it was a year ago last month that we first began our conversation about this. And I have a background in journalism as well, which I apologize for. And but writing case statements, what I've learned is that oftentimes I'll get 2 days to go to an organization. And I have 2 days to talk to between 10 and 20 people, and I've got to come out of there and write about a 2,000-word article to support some kind of campaign of theirs that sounds like they wrote it themselves. So with that background, over 65 cases for Jerry, coming into this, I think almost gave me an advantage that I wasn't a part of of heritage, that because I just got to speak to so many wonderful people and get a different view of John and his principles and his life from so many different people, and then try to synthesize that into what these principles could be fleshed out to talk about fundraising in general. I think one of the things that I think it excited both of us, one of our readers who helped us kind of critique and looked at it said, you know, this is a book about fundraising, but it's really a book about life. And I think that also reflects how John approached, at least this was my takeaway, is that this is how these principles related not just to how you could develop support for an organization, but how you can live and how you can relate to people. So it was a delightful process all the way through.
Amen. That's great. Well, I ask each of you, maybe go back to Lee. Any, upon reading the book and upon your experiences with Heritage, and as a fundraiser yourself, what are the top couple of takeaways you had from whether it be the lessons, the chapters, or the stories?
Right. Well, I think John always stressed, and I interviewed him when I wrote the history of Heritage, Leading the Way, in the biography of Ed Fulner. Talking with him, he always said, mission first, and that the money follows the mission. And it's so easy in fundraising, and I have done some, though I have not raised $1 billion. That's it's so easy to talk about money first. And he would say, wait, you got to turn it around. You got to turn it around. You got to begin with the mission. That's the most important thing. I think, secondly, his insight in saying that you must get to know the donor. You must understand him or her. You can't just sort of guess about that. Now, that means you got to take time. It can't be done just bang like that. You got to take some time to develop this relationship, which then becomes a friendship. And Dr. Catherine Davis, who gave a pretty fair sum of money here, what,
$26 million.
$26 million, not a serious thing. Over the years, John got to know her so well, and they would get together and they would talk about family, and they would share pictures of the kids and the grandkids and the great-great-grandkids. And whenever she had a birthday, he'd be there, and maybe it was even her last birthday or next to last or something like that. John, as he usually was there talking with her down in Florida, having a good time. And the phone would ring, and it would be some other foundation or some other fundraiser coming in to say congratulations. And she'd say, oh, thank you so very much. Oh, by the way, John Von Cannon's here. Would you like to talk to him? And, John didn't take advantage of it either. He didn't take advantage of it. But he understood that you had to have this special personal touch. And, of course, the humor, you're so right. How many of his jokes could we tell in this family mixed audience?
We've done it.
Yeah.
We just did.
Got to be careful about that. But he saw humor in it. And I think also something else is that his intellectual interests were extraordinary. Mm-hmm. You know, the books that he would read, the novels. He'd read novels, or he would read the latest he loved biography or history. So it wasn't the latest Napoleon Hill, how to do it kind of a thing. Had a much broader, deeper kind of thing. And I think that's what was part of John's personality. And what he was trying to impart to people is to have as big and as broad and as deep an understanding and a life as you can have.
You know, and it strikes me, and this is lessons for all of us going forward, as Paul said, a life lesson. he did read a lot, and he used that reading. I mean, you'd be in a meeting with him the next day, and he'd start talking about, lesson from On Call, the last call, the Prohibition book, and this is what, and he would. And he'd practice it, and he'd rehearse it, and the jokes, the same thing. There were lessons in them, but people know my wife and I, Christy, we both work here at Heritage, so I would come home and say, "Hey, did you hear the one?" She'd say, "Stop it, John already told me," because John would practice the jokes by going around from office to office and get a reaction, and there was joy in that. Obviously, he liked that. That was a lot of fun. But clearly, it was his craft, and we all ought to learn from that as well. Not just to tell the jokes, but think about the craft and honing that craft. JB, any lessons that you took from this?
Yeah, I was just thinking, you couldn't not laugh at one of John's jokes, right? Because he would laugh harder than anybody else. And it would feel awkward if you didn't laugh. But they were funny too, just couldn't help it. But I wrote down 5 different lessons. I just thought of these, of what I learned from John. And the first one was the one you mentioned in the opening, is take what you do seriously, but don't take yourself so seriously. I'm just curious, how many of you here have worked with John in one capacity or another throughout the years? Okay, all right, so a lot of you. So was he not the most fun person to sit next to in a meeting or a conference, right? He would always joke and cut up, and he was keeping things that can be stale a little bit more lively. And it was always a joy to sit next to him. I never thought he wasn't taking what he did not seriously. He was very serious about what he did. But he had a good time, and it was contagious. So taking what you do seriously, but not what you're taking yourself so seriously, is something I take to heart. Something John reminds our development team all the time. Second thing is something Lee mentioned, is listening. This is an important lesson I learned from John. How do you build relationships that are intentional and meaningful? Is you listen to somebody. You can't understand somebody else's passion or goals if you're talking the whole time. So listening, in the book, Paul and I talk about 4 different ways of improving your listening skills. They are: be present, be real, be sure, and be honest. I won't go into detail of either one of those, but I would love to encourage you to read the book. But I will say that if my wife is listening right now, streaming online, that the book is complete, but I am still a work in progress. So listening is very important. Be thoughtful. John taught me how to be thoughtful. A few years ago, Don Rumsfeld traveled the country with us to talk about his book and to do a series of events. And at the end of one of the events, he allowed us to have a personal dinner, a private dinner with about 12 donors in Houston. So we were in a high-end steakhouse, beautiful setting, had a private reception area and then a private room for the 12 guests. When we went into the room after the reception, I did not put the name tags down at where the donors should sit. I didn't think that was a big deal. And it wasn't that big a deal, but Don Rumsfeld, the professional he is, sat right in the middle of the table, and all the other donors, I helped direct where they're supposed to sit. Well, at the end of the time together, it was great experience. The donors had a really nice time. But John pulled me aside afterwards, and he said, great event, great dinner, but you need to put place cards in front of each donor to let them know where to sit. And I thought, he's just being a little critical, just trying to encourage me to do better. And I was like, John, I don't know if it is that important. And he said, JB, you need to put the place cards where the donor is supposed to sit. And I thought, okay, yes, sir. And I didn't want to hear criticism because I thought it was a good event. And as I reflected on that, he wasn't being critical of me. He was trying to teach me to be thoughtful to donors. If you're going into a room with a high-profile guest, they don't want to be impolite by sitting somewhere they shouldn't sit, right? Simple. So it's a little awkward. So if you have the place cards where it's like John Hillbolt did for us, where we're supposed to sit, the high-profile guest, then it's a polite thing to do. You got be thoughtful. This is the third thing. Fourth thing is in the book as well. It's a slogan that we created in 2008, 2009. Be near, dear, and clear to donors. At that time in our country, we had a major recession. A lot of people lost retirement funds, they lost wealth, the stock market crashed. So a lot of donors pulled back on their giving. And they just couldn't give, or they didn't feel like they could give. So John von Kannon inspired this thought of being near, dear, and clear. What does that mean? Near means to keep talking to the donors even if they can't give, especially if they can't give, John would argue. Because if you're pulled back and somebody's in a crisis situation, what is that telling them? That you're all about the money. Right. If you're near them and empathize with them, then they will realize that you're more than a dollar sign. You're actually a meaningful partner in the cause that you believe in. Dear means be empathetic. Understand where the donor is coming from. John had a famous saying that he would tell us all the time. He said, donors are donors some of the time, but they're people all of the time. Right? And so if you're empathetic to the situations they're in, if they're in a crisis, being near and dear to them is very important to build that relationship. And being clear about the mission that you believe in, clear about what we're passionate about, reminding that donor, even if they're in a crisis, what their dollar went to help. Being clear on the mission and the impact. So near, dear, and clear is something I learned. And the fifth thing I learned is know your audience. From John, know your audience. My first donor trip, major donor trip to California 8 years ago was with John von Kannon. And he's a senior counselor and vice president of Heritage. I was a remote worker, and I was trying my best to make a good impression, right? So I didn't want things to fall through the crack. I read everything I could. I prepared for each meeting. I confirmed each meeting, all the logistics, everything that goes into a donor trip. And I thought, okay, I got this, no problem. Well, I pull around in the morning before our visits to pick John up, and he steps in the car, and he's wearing a Hawaiian shirt and slacks, appropriate for California, right? He looks at me, I'm in a suit. He goes, what are you doing? And I said, we're Heritage, we wear suits. He said, we're Heritage in California. They don't wear suits and ties in California. So he said, take your tie off. So I took the tie off. We met with the man that morning. I didn't pack anything else. All I had was suits the whole time, the 3 days. So Tom Meehan was the man we're meeting with in the morning. Very gracious gentleman. And he and John proceeded to make fun of me. John introduced me as the rookie from Heritage who doesn't know how to dress in Southern California. But it was appropriate humor. But I learned you got to know your audience, right? Know your audience. Make them at ease. Think about the donor, not yourself. Think about the mission, not yourself.
You ought to hear the one when John came back from that trip and said, J.B. Horton is stripping in my car. So I hadn't heard the rest of the context of that, so it's useful. Yeah. So Paul, a couple lessons you've drawn from this. I mean, you really helped to craft these chapters.
Well, I appreciate that. And you're going to think that we've compared notes to make this sound like this cohesive, but we did not. It just, I think it speaks to the power of some of John's thoughts that we come away with things that are very close. We're all kind of describing the elephant from our own perspective. But my takeaways after doing so many enjoyable interviews and reading many of the books, talk about John reading, by the way. JB asked if I would like to see some of John's books, and I said, sure, send them. And I got a call a few days later from my wife who said, what is this box? It weighed about 100 pounds and got to it was his books. It was fabulous.
Sorry, Sherry. I'm sorry about that.
My first lesson I took away is that relationships form the foundation of everything. And I mentioned earlier about interviewing for a case statement. As you talk to as many people to get a picture, I look for commonalities in those interviews. What's being told to me again and again and again? And again and again and again, people zeroed in on John on the integrity of his relationships, and that it was about people first, and that, as you said, it's that people are people all the time. He also, one of his chapters was that tell stories Jesus spoke in parables, and we actually wove a parable into from Matthew 7 into the book, and it's the one, and you all know it, it's the one about the two houses, one built on a firm foundation, one built on sand. And when the storm comes, which one stands up? Well, it's the one built on a foundation. I took away that relationships are the foundation of the art and science of fundraising, and that if you build anything on another foundation, it's not going to stand. You're not going to have long-term success. Relationships first. my second takeaway is really builds on that. It's that you can't fake real. Relationships must be built on genuine interest and affection. And the note I had for myself is near, dear, and clear. And I won't go over all that again, but I do want to tell you one thing. Just by dint of scheduling, John was one of my later interviews in this process, which actually turned out to be good because I could ask more intelligent questions. But you were the one who told me about near, dear, and clear. And as I was reviewing my notes, trying to kind of prepare for this, I looked at the notes I was taking during that interview, and in all capital letters I had written, "This is big." Because it was so clear that this is about that relationships can't be transactional, they can't be plotted, they've got to be real. And that idea of being near, it really struck me of that when someone can't give, that's the time to let you know that relationship's real. So that relationship has to rise from genuine interest and affection in the person. My third takeaway was you must be committed to your own cause before your own success. And I want to be clear, I'm committed to my success, and I know all of you are too, but when it comes to a mission-driven organization like Heritage or like any other one, you've got to be committed to that mission first. It was so enjoyable to interview so many Heritage people and hear the commitment to the cause and to the mission of the organization and its values. And I started thinking, what if you guys hired just kind of some freelance fundraiser, have suitcase, will travel, not committed to come in? That person would stick out like a sore thumb in this organization. And the people that were being tried to solicited or relationships built would get that right away. Because people are attracted to people who are committed. There's a quote we used in the book, and I wanted to just read it to you. It's from Jason Nazar, who is a writer for the Wall Street Journal and Forbes, but also he got that privilege because he's an entrepreneur and a CEO. And he says, "There's no quality as compelling, intoxicating, and attractive as certainty. It is the person who has an unbridled sense of certainty that will always be able to persuade others. If you really believe in what you do, you will always be able to persuade others to do what's right for them while getting what you want in return." And I love that last sentence because it's your belief leads you to develop relationships that cause a connection back to your mission. So it's actually the person donating is doing what's right for them. You're not selling them into doing it. You're relating them into doing it. You're hooking them up to a passion that they now share with you. And your certainty does that. My fourth was that the internal culture of an organization will affect external relationships. JB and I found this verse in Proverbs 23:7 we put in there that said, "As a man thinketh, so he is." And so the point being is that whatever conversations are going around a water cooler in an organization, however you refer to the people who support you, if it's different from what you tell people outside your organization, that is eventually going to show up. And so we talk about the need for the culture inside to reflect your actions outside and vice versa. And what I put was, it's vital to create the culture you want others to see and respond to because they will. They're going to see who you are. My final takeaway, and by the way, I found that encouraging because you know the culture of your organization, and it encourages you to be who you are, both inside and outside. My final takeaway was John's 9th chapter. One small refinement. I'm not a fundraiser. I'm a writer. I write about fundraising, but you guys have forgotten more about this craft than I know. But this is one thing I learned. This is hard work. It takes work. And I think people think friendship/relationship, that sounds easy, friendship's fun. Well, I think we all know friendship actually is hard work. Marriage is hard work. Relationships are hard work. So developing relationships that have integrity, that then can lead to connection to cause, that's work.
Yeah. Amen. Thank you, Paul. Thinking about that relationship topic or friendship topic, one thing that struck me, I was speaking with a colleague about this 2 weeks ago, and it might be a corollary to one of John's rules in this way, is that the relationship are between the institution and the donor, and the fundraiser is the conduit. And John always told a story about, and there was a period, I think probably Phil was in the mid-'80s or so, we called it the dark years, where John took a sabbatical from Heritage and went to another organization for a couple years. And Lee mentioned Catherine Davis. The organization asked him, said, "John, great, you're now here. Can you give Shelby Davis and Catherine Davis a call? You know them really well. And John said, no, I don't know them really well. The vice president of development at Heritage Foundation knows them really well. That's who the relationship is with. And he actually refused to make that call in that regard. He said, maybe we'll meet them through events or other things, but let's build up our own program through our own relationships there. And they did. And eventually the grass wasn't greener. So John, thank you, Phil. You brought John back. So let's have a chance to talk with you. Love to hear any questions you've got, stories, observations, thoughts about fundraising, John, life in general. What do you think?
Donald Trump.
Yeah. You can wake up every day thinking, what would John say about it?
It's funny.
Right?
It's funny you mention that because one of the jokes he told me in that last meeting was about Donald Trump. He didn't know he was going to be president. But, I cannot. I can later.
Isabel. All right. Wait, that's right.
So as a young fundraiser here at the Heritage Foundation, what would you all say if you were speaking for John? No, not that you could or should, but if you had the opportunity right now, what advice would you give to somebody like me?
Are you saying I'm not young? Is that what you're saying? I think, what I did early in my tenure at Heritage is I tried to learn as much as I could from people that knew what they were talking about. And some people like to talk, and some people like to do. John could do both. He knew how to tell a story, but he was a practitioner for years. So I would encourage you to get a mentor, somebody you can learn from, somebody you can trust and share with and grow in that regard. But I think what Paul said is right. It takes a lot of hard work. There's no substitute for it. It just does. So I would say get a mentor and work hard.
And read our book.
That is what John would say. Yes.
Got a couple of.
I'd say be yourself too, Isabel. And that's that is one thing John talked a lot about. When you try to be somebody else or try to act, mimic somebody else or mimic another fundraiser or another business, you wind up chasing them, leapfrog them. Be yourself, know who you are, and be curious. And the whole concept of his books and what he was reading was this curiosity that just helped him grow, and others around him. It was contagious.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm over here.
Hi.
If the culture of your organization doesn't reflect what you're trying to promote, how do you start to turn that ship around so that you are more consistent with your internal culture and what you're promoting publicly?
I'd like to defer to John Fogarty on that one.
Sure. I'd say be yourself again. The culture matters so much. It will destroy an organization if it's not tended to. You have to understand what the culture is first, so it's probably useful to do a little bit of an audit of what it is. What do we act? And frankly, we're doing a lot of that within our own development team right now. Tomorrow, 9 to 1, we're hosting a development culture program. This is, we try to understand who we are, why we do things, how we do them. But it's really about the why. I mean, focus on what it ought to be. Talk to leaders in the organization. Ask them the questions about it. Sometimes you can assume that the culture is bad or it's off, but they may not have even thought about that. I mean, Phil Trulock here has done for years, has recommended books on culture, has imbued a knowledge of what the heritage culture is, and that it ought to be promulgated, because it does exist, but it's not all that helpful if it's not promulgated, it's not talked about, put in writing. And cultures can change too. Leaders can change cultures, and that happens over time. But if the rest of the organization, if the bedrock of the organization, and by the way, the donors are part of that bedrock, the members support it, are cognizant of that culture, they're going to help keep it strong. So find the advocates you've got on there, understand what the culture actually is, ask the leaders if they really know that, can they define the culture, and then start a conversation to, if you feel it's off course, how do we redirect it? Am I off on that, other thoughts?
Yeah.
I would add one thing to that, is that the first chapter of the book is about integrity matters, it really matters. And in researching that, we came up with a scenario of looking at how do you develop a strategic plan for a business? How do you develop the direction? And it was interesting to me is that you tend to think it's about goals or kind of the overall mission of the company, but it turned out that every single source I found said the direction of a business, its strategic plan or an organization should rise from its values. You have to know your core values. And culture, I think, rises from values. When you're talking about your culture will either be in conflict or in concert with your values, and that gives you something you can measure. So you have to know what you're about, and then ask yourself, does this culture reflect what we say we're about? One quick anecdote, I found that there was a doctor at Henry Ford Hospital, a cardiologist named Rana Ondish, and while making her rounds, her liver ruptured, and whatever it was she had made her blood unable to clot, and she was bleeding to death on the floor of her own hospital. They were able to save her, but she got the experience of being a patient over months in the hospital and discovered that the patient care they delivered was horrible. And it was that kind of experience that told her, we have to go back and get back to what is it that we say we're about, and are we about that? And so it can be a process of months or even years of changing your culture. I think everyone knows culture changes heart, but it begins from values.
I had one cultural thing here at Heritage. We have, in our fundraising team, we have planning sessions. We have one in January, we have one in July, and we think through the strategies we have in mind for those partners, those donors. If we were around a table and we were talking about a donor to say, oh, she's a good target, we're going to go hit her up and bang the tin cup, that kind of language internally may seem harmless because you're talking to internal people, but it's harmful. Mm-hmm. If you have that kind of culture, it's going to bleed out, and then eventually you're going to talk to a supporter that way. That's inappropriate. So guard your own language. Language matters. We talk about that in the book. I know John Von Kannon would particularly take interest if a solicitor would lead their discussion with, well, my donor, blah, 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 blah. And he would say, whose donor? Is that your donor? Or do you own them? Or is it Heritage's supporter? Anyway, the language matters, and being respectful both on stage and behind the scenes. That's integrity, and that's what we try to do with our plan sessions.
He'd even go a step further and say it's not even Heritage's donor. We're their organization. We're their conservative cause. So the ownership relationship is them on us, just like that patient care.
Exactly. Well said. Yep.
Brian Riley.
So as most of you know, I'm in the research department here at Heritage. So Lee, like you, I don't make it up to the 8th floor. You probably make it up more than I do. And I'm not out in Texas visiting with donors a lot. And I'm wondering, as a researcher, is this a book that you recommend that I read, or is it really targeted to people whose career is fundraising? Because it sounds like from your conversation, it may be the former. I just was curious about that.
What do you think, Lee?
Well, I think it's clear that you cannot try to raise funds or connect with the donor unless you understand the culture. So I think that this book is important because it's not just a how-to-do book. This book also talks about values. This also talks about ideas. Talks about first principles. And that was one of John's strengths. And I think you can trace it back to the fact that he was not only a vice president of the Heritage Foundation, but was also a leading conservative. And he saw Heritage as part of the conservative movement. If I may say so, not only a part of it, but a leader of it. A battleship, an aircraft carrier of the armada of the conservative movement. So that was part of, I think, John's success, a part of his ability to balance the how and the why throughout his career. And I think that's reflected in this little book. But also, we could share, we should come up with a list of John's books, maybe the top 10 or 20 of John's books, and have that as an addendum as well. I don't know whether we get to that or not.
Actually, today, John Von Kannon Day, we are inaugurating the Von Kannon collection as part of the Robert Richardson collection in the True Luck Training Center at Heritage. So on the, thanks to Cindy's generosity, on the third floor of Heritage within our training library, there are more than 50 of John's books that he read, many of them on fundraising, others on life, some histories as well, available to all. Heritage as part of the 800 or 900 volume training center at the within the True Luck Center here. John had this great quote, the Jefferson quote. I think it was from a letter that Jefferson had written to Adams, and it was on a little pillar on his desk. It said, "I cannot live without books, but fewer will suffice, where amusement and not use is the only way forward." And I was reading, and mostly he just said, "I just cannot live without books." I read this morning about where that quote came from, and it was Jefferson when he was selling his books to the Library to Congress. He actually sold his library after the British burned the Capitol. The library went with it. Jefferson had the renowned collection of books anywhere in the United States at the time, and decided that Congress needed research. Well, that's kind of like a heritage story as well, right? They ought to be reading, they ought to be understanding, and he surrounded himself with books that gave it. And at the time, he was writing to Adams, his friend, and talked about how he couldn't live without books. John could not live without books. He thrived on them. It's now part of our collection here for all to use. And that's not just at Heritage. That I think I could speak for the True Luck Center that would be applicable to anybody in the movement who'd like to use them as well.
Totally. I just want to add one shameless plug for the book. You asked if research should read this kind of book. One of the best compliments I think Paul and I had through this process, we had several beta readers. Jeff was one of our beta readers, but Ron Lazoff he's a great supporter, good friend of Heritage for a long time. I asked him as a donor, would you read this book and give me your thoughts? He said he loved the book. He didn't think it was a fundraising book. He thought it was, and he's a sales guy. He was CEO of a major company. And he said, this is a book for all salespeople. In fact, it's a book I want to give my grandkids. And I thought, wow, that's the biggest compliment anybody could give. But I think Lee's right. It's a book on the why to of fundraising more than the how to.
And there's relationship advice in there too, Brian. So, for anybody, as Jeff points out,
That's true.
There's Jeff Trimbath here, one of the beta readers. I think it took Jeff a little longer to read than others, right? But he does presentations to our group very often and talks about the analogies between dating and fundraising, and that you can reverse those analogies as well. I mean, just look at the bookmark and the rules there. Integrity matters; it really matters. Listening is better than talking. All these rules. It's a life book, really. You can apply it to fundraising, but it is a life book. So that's kind of neat.
And it won't take that long. It's honestly written to be read. It's not a huge volume. It would probably take you two long plane rides. It was designed for fundraisers.
In private jets, right? Yes, sir. Andrew.
Thank you for all of your insight. I really learned a lot today. Do you think there is any effective way of thinking or philosophy to find a new potential donor as well as maintaining the existing donors?
I'll start with you, JB. Got some thoughts.
At Heritage, we have a robust prospecting outreach program, and we try to identify people that might not be in the Heritage family yet, but who could possibly be part of our apparatus. So we, through our direct mail program, Christy's here, we often reach out and ask people if they would be willing to consider being part of our efforts. So we do that on the direct mail side. With the major gift side, when it's relational, we have about 500,000 members or so. we have to be intentional with how we're, frankly, spending time and resources. And you can't talk to all 500,000 people. So we want to try to be as focused as we can, partnering with people that can make a big impact and also utilizing our time well. So we try to identify those. And a lot of times, like Paul and Lee have said earlier, it takes time. And it's not an easy single silver bullet, but as far as building up those prospects to make potential major donors, it does take time and intentional effort. Don't know if that answers your question very well, but that's kind of what we do here. So.
Lee, you have built an organization in victims of
Yeah.
communism over the years.
Well, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, our mission is to educate this generation and future generations about the history, philosophy, and legacy of communism. And that's particularly apt these days because, unfortunately, there has been a renewed interest in socialism, quote, quote, on our college campuses. And as we know, there are a lot of close relationship between communism and socialism. So how do you go about educating young people about that? And we've done that through a curriculum for high school students, which is a history to be used in history classes, a curriculum. We have done it through electronic means, a newsletter. We've also done it by going to Times Square. Any of you remember?
I wondered if that was yours.
Up there
Striking.
in Times Square for about 4 months, we had a donor who was willing to underwrite a series of electronic messages in Times Square. And so you'd look up and there you are, perhaps on your way to a theater. It's a bit of a shocker and it says, "Communism kills." Wow, what's all that about? And then we go ... Communism kills free speech. Communism kills free assembly. Communism kills the rule of law. And coming out of that, and there's a little thing there that says, get in touch with victims of communism. We have picked up, and we know thousands of people saw it, and we know some of them have come back to us and said, we want to know more. I want to know more about this. So you use the means of communication, colleges, high schools, the public as well, to try to draw attention to the reality of communism. As you all may know, there are still 5 communist regimes in the world. There's China, Vietnam, Laos, North Korea, and Cuba. And those are still communist regimes who suppress basic human rights and liberties. So we've got a lot of work to do. Using mass media is probably the most effective way we have found for what we do. And of course, Heritage does that to a fairly well, doesn't it?
Your talk of communism reminded me of the Cold War and reminded me of John, of course, who you've probably heard this before, but if you haven't, John was a practicing Catholic. During Catholic Mass, there is what's called the sign of peace, where you reach out and offer peace to others, and you say, "Peace be with you." You reach to your neighbor, and during the Cold War, John would respond to that with, "Peace through strength." And that was his part of fighting the Reds.
I love that. That's John.
Other thoughts,
That's
questions,
the essence of
observations?
John. That's the essence.
I see a number of Heritage alumni in the out here as well, and be interested in any observations you've got.
Come on, Ann. Yeah.
Ann.
Get Ann.
Yes, hello. I loved what you talked about, John's love of books, and I think that just ties into just his general love of learning. And he actually didn't even care what the source was. Because I noticed he would take ideas of some entry-level person, an intern, shared some idea with him. Next thing you know, he's telling us, "Hey, that was a great idea. Let's think about that." So I just always appreciated, when I joined the development team, I was really unqualified to take that job, Phil. And Phil nods his head. Yes, but so I would bring in my ideas, and I mean, in retrospect, yeah, some of them probably weren't so great, but a couple were gems. But John would take everything. He'd listen very intently to whatever idea you had, and he'd really consider it, and and good ideas he would try to incorporate. So anyway, it was a great lesson learned from me that you don't just assume that just experience in the workplace or education is the only source of great ideas. They can really come from anywhere.
Amen. And Anne has a great poem which she wrote. If you're ever interested, it's about John and his legacy. She read it at his memorial service here. It's fantastic. Phil.
Well, I knew John before he had the 10 laws. It's a lot of it he learned through hard work, obviously. But when he first came to Heritage, he was probably late 20s, I guess. He'd just come from the American Spectator. And Fulner had hired him and said, "This guy's going to be a great fundraiser." And I said, "I don't know who he is, but okay, we'll take him on." So I was so impressed with John that we just started throwing everything on him. And he came up with strategies and stuff. And we had a board member named Jack Eckert who started all the Eckert drugstores. And he had just joined our board. He was given, I don't know, $5,000, $10,000. So Von Kannon comes in to see me one day and he says, "You need to go down and get near, dear, and clear." So he didn't have those terms. And he said, "You need to get down to see Florida and see Jack." I said, "Sure, I'll be glad to do that." I said, "And you need to ask him for $1 million." Well, okay. I've never asked anybody for $1 million before, but this is the big fundraising guy. He knows exactly what he's doing. So I get on a plane and go down to St. Petersburg and visit Jack. And I'm making my pitch and stuff, and I said, "We'd like to ask you for $1 million." Jack started laughing at me. He said, "I'm not going to give you $1 million. Why would I do that?" So I get back, I said, "John, I went down there and did exactly what you told me to. I followed the script and asked him for $1 million, and he laughed at me." And John said, "Well, I guess I got that one wrong."
Know yourself. That's right. Other thoughts, questions? Nick Reed?
I was on the other side of that, Phil. I was the mentee. And I thought it was worth noting that John, always had a huge personality, filled the room with it, with his jokes and everything, but he was also extremely humble. And it was a side that a lot of people maybe missed. But I remember traveling with him several times, and we'd be at an event or something like that. He'd give a speech, or we'd be in a donor meeting. The first question he'd always ask me is, "What'd I do wrong? What could I do better?" He'd be asking for my feedback, and I'd be thinking, you want my advice? But he was always learning, and I think that was a part of his, always consuming new books and new ideas. And I'm guessing, JB, that may have been why he could never arrive on that ninth principle. He was always questioning whether there was something better. He was always challenging himself, and that is something I've always taken with me as well. The other thing is I just remember he was a really direct guy when he needed to be direct, and that's something I've taken with me. I remember I was promoted into management younger than I probably should have been. So I remember coming out of a meeting one time.
Sorry.
Yeah. I remember coming out of a meeting one time, and John and I had kind of butted heads a little bit. And so we went back into his office just to, iron things out, smooth things over, tell a few jokes, hug and make up. And my dad had actually just died. And he sat down, and he completely ignored everything that we had just disagreed upon in the meeting. He goes, "Nick, I know your dad just died." He goes, "I remember when my dad died." He said, that was one of the hardest days of my life. But then he turned it right around, and he He said, but no, now you need to grow up. He said, now you've got a choice in front of you. And he goes, you've got an opportunity. You've got a lot of talent and potential. He said, but you need to now, move on. And I really appreciated that, and it was exactly what I needed to hear at that moment. And there's very few people in this world that'll say something like that to you, to your face. So God help us have more John Von Cannons.
Amen. Great lesson.
Well said.
Kim? All right. Kim Dennis?
Well, since you brought up the dark years, John, when John was out in California, well, as it happened, I was actually out there at the same time. And John and I had gotten to know each other when I was working at a foundation in New York. And then I left that job and went out to the West Coast to take another job. And John left Heritage to go out to the West Coast, and we both soon realized that neither of us were really happy West Coasters, and we missed the East Coast, but during the time we were there, we got together. I wasn't there for very long. I smartened up faster than he did and got back, but so we'd get together and had a couple of long pity parties together where we would get together and commiserate about our lives. But then we both ended up not long after back in the East Coast, and I took a job at another foundation. And it didn't even occur to me until you guys were talking today that during that whole process, John and I were just the same friends we were when I was at the foundation prior. And then I went back and started working at another foundation, and our relationship was just the same. It never occurred to me that our relationship would change because I wasn't working at a grant-making organization. I think it just speaks to the way he put the relationships ahead of it. It never even occurred to me till now that maybe he shouldn't have been my friend during those years. So.
Well, that's great. Mary Miller.
I think everybody's touched a little bit on what a phenomenal mentor John was, and I was very grateful to be working for him when I also took my first steps into parenthood, because those life lessons he just so naturally oozed. But John's a gift that I continue to receive as I have more experiences in a fundraising career. Like, words of John's make more sense, or I recall stories, and it's aha moments, and it's really, really wonderful. And the thing I always come back to with John, and I wonder if you have an insight, is in fundraising we think a lot about the asking or the getting in the front door, but John had such a natural instinct and gift for stewardship. I think about a donor who had fallen on hard times, but he had been a major gift donor. And John continued to stay in touch with them. John, despite all the priorities going on, John continued that relationship. He was stewarding that gift sort of in perpetuity. And I think that's a phenomenal example. But knowing how many different priorities fundraisers juggle on a daily basis, like, how do you think about that institutionally?
What we live by, and John lived by, preached, talked about, is do the right thing. It's the right thing to do. It doesn't need to be. We don't need to write a book about it. It's a simple wisdom. Sometimes you do need to say it. Again, I think the city kind of gets itself consumed with, when individuals get themselves consumed with one another here, and that's why this whole thing of take your job seriously, don't take yourself too seriously, do the right thing. It was the right thing to continue that relationship with that donor, because for who he was as a human being, as a man, and who knows what happens next, and that's it's a kind of a golden rule. I don't know if it's that. Maybe it's not that simple.
Yeah, I think also you look back to his faith, and that was so, I think, formational for him, that faith, hope, and love, those three virtues, which are so important in Christianity and Catholicism, that he practiced them every day.
I think if you look at the laws, John made a point of writing 3 different ways of saying making the case is more important than asking for the gift. Asking for the gift without making the case is deadly. Making the case is, and then asking is best. Obviously, he wanted to make sure whoever's reading this would know that the mission and the case is more important. And sometimes for that individual that's going through a hard time or can't give at any given moment, that person could be a multi-million-dollar giver in the future. That's not why John was doing that. John was doing that because that's who he is. I mean, when you go through an adversity, in a trial yourself, your real person comes out. John was a very giving person, right? So I think to learn that is a good thing for all of us, to learn about the character traits. The fruits of it could be there for the organization later, but just doing the right thing by the donor, no matter what the circumstance. That's just a lesson that all of us can, I think, live by. So doing the right thing. Sometimes it's not the easy thing to do the right thing. But if you do it over time, I think it pays off.
Right. Jeff Trimba.
JB, your comment about sometimes it's not the easy thing, but it's the right thing prompted a memory. I just, first couple of years I was here, 8 years ago, just remember John Von Kannon really valuing our team and valuing the way that our team was treated by folks. And it's just one story of a fellow development team member who was absolutely chewed out by a donor. And to the point where she cried right in front of this donor, you know, it was sort of a public kind of thing. It was just an awful experience for this fellow teammate. John's response was clear. It was unequivocal. I think the person was a $25,000 donor. He called the guy and said, "This will never happen. You will never do this again," to one of our members. And that communicated volumes to me as a colleague of this fellow employee, because it conveyed to me that he was not out just to chase the fast buck, but he truly valued not only donors as people, but employees as people. So integrity is just great.
Yeah, do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Yeah, someone famous said that, right?
Yeah. Lee Edwards.
Lee Edwards.
Well, good. Any closing thoughts, guys? Maybe start with you, Lee.
Just I think it's very difficult to think of John without getting a smile on your face, and thanking God that we had the opportunity to work with him, to be with him, to be inspired by him, and to be lifted up by him.
I feel that exact same way, and I didn't know him. It was just to hear so many people talk about him, and again, when you get so many views, I think what's real begins to emerge. For me, it was just a privilege to get to know him through others' eyes, and then to be able to try to share some of these principles. It was just a joy.
This is the day of celebration. You know, it's John Von Kannon Day at Heritage. What a privilege it is to be here with all of you. I'm glad the book is done. We have it in print now, so hopefully it will be something that will bear fruit for our team now, but maybe years and years from now, to capture what John brought to this team. He is a pillar. In the opening forward, Ed Fulner talks about one of the best decisions he ever made was to hire John Von Kannon. John became a pillar of this institution, and we're grateful for him, grateful for Cindy and family. You'll always be family. So thank you all. This has been great, John.
Awesome. Thank you, JB. And congratulations to you and Paul on this book. This is real. This will serve a lot of folks far into the future. One of the things we were talking about, just in terms of the marketing and the next steps here for the book itself, is looking at opportunities to put some coursework together through chapters of the book and the like, some online and video components of it as well. So more to come on that. This is, JB thinks the job is done, but yes.
We've
Jason
got-
and Sarah will be part of that draft.
Perfect. We've got much more to learn from John and his wisdom. So congratulations to you guys as well. We wish everybody a very fun day. Look at today. Think about John. Think about the lessons you can learn. Read the book and come on back for more. Please join me in congratulating and thanking Lee and Paul and JB on this great project. And lastly, there are copies of the book for everybody who's attended today. There are copies right out as you exit, so you can take a copy home for yourself.